Hi, listeners. This is the 80,000 Hours podcast, where we have unusually in-depth conversations about the world's most pressing problems, what you can do to solve them, and whether you can negotiate an arms control treaty with someone at the same time you're fighting a proxy war against them. I'm Rob Wiblin, head of research at 80,000 Hours. I interviewed Samuel Charap back in March, and the episode was incredibly popular, deservedly so in my opinion. Sadly, the war in Ukraine seems to be far from over. And last time I had to cut a lot of questions I had for Sam just because we didn't have time to get to them. So I thought the issue was well worth revisiting. Today, I first ask Sam for an update on the military situation on the ground as of the 21st of July, and then bring up various opinions that he or I expressed back in March to see where we've updated our understanding of things. We then turn to various potential broader lessons we might be able to take away from the situation regarding the right policy response, how worried we should be about escalation spirals in similar situations in future, as well as the viability of future arms control agreements between the US and Russia. Finally, we talk briefly about a possible ceasefire agreement proposal that came up during the negotiations between Russia and Ukraine in late March, a proposal that Sam wanted to highlight as possibly the least unpromising path forward. We've got a few important announcements today, which I'll briefly mention here, then explain in full in the outro to the interview. First off, for the first time since 2020, we are running our user survey. Our user survey is your chance to let us know whether our advice and resources have helped or maybe harmed you in your efforts to do good. You can also just tell us what you've liked or not liked about your experience with 80,000 Hours, whether you've shifted what you're planning to do or not. It's one of the main sources of information we use both to adjust our services and to figure out which of our products are worth continuing or expanding. For instance, your feedback on the show in 2020 was one of the reasons that I shifted to working on podcasting almost full-time. I'll explain more about the user survey in the outro to the episode, but you can reach it now if you'd like by going to 80,000hours.org/survey. This year's survey closes soon on the 14th of August, so please do fill it out quickly, as we won't have another chance to remind you before then. The second announcement today is that we're currently hiring someone to join our marketing team. This year, we've begun investing quite a bit more heavily in trying to grow our audience, and someone in this role would likely work on promoting this show among all of the other services that 80,000 Hours offers. I'll also have more to say about that position in the outro, but note that applications for the role close on the 23rd of August, and you can find the full job description and see how to apply at 80,000hours.org/marketer. Okay, without further ado, I again bring you Sam Charap. Today, I'm speaking again with Samuel Charap. Sam is a senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation. His research interests include the foreign policies of Russia and the former Soviet states, as well as US-Russia deterrence, strategic stability, and arms control, topics he has been working on for well over a decade. In 2017, Sam co-authored a book on the Ukraine crisis called Everyone Loses: The Ukraine Crisis and the Ruinous Contest for Post-Soviet Eurasia. In my view, he's been one of the most informed voices on the war in Ukraine, and his first episode on the show back in March, episode 123, got more listeners in its first month than any other episode of the show. Thanks for coming back on the podcast, Sam.
Thanks for having me.
Back in March, you were obviously in super high demand and could only spare an hour for us. So we said we would come back later in the year to check what we'd managed to get right and wrong and see if we could learn some extra lessons from how things had played out once we had more information. I guess to open, let's get a quick update on the state of play in Ukraine at the moment. To me, I have the feeling that the general public has lost a decent amount of interest in the war over the last few months. But in the meantime, it seems like Russia has been making incremental gains across the south and east of Ukraine. In the east, it now controls all of Luhansk and most of Donetsk, the two provinces which make up the so-called Donbas region, where there's, the greatest density of Russian speakers. It controls most of Kharkiv region, including up to about 40 kilometers out from Kharkiv city, which was Ukraine's second largest city before the war started. And it also controls most of the regions of Kherson in the south and the majority of Zaporizhia in the southeast. How would you summarize the state of play in the war on the ground now?
Well, I think the big change came, probably just after we spoke at the very end of March, beginning of April, when essentially Russia decided to dramatically shift its war aims, gave up on taking the capital and taking several other major north and northeastern cities, and concentrated the majority of its war effort on the Donbass. By that time, it had already taken control over most of the two southern regions that you mentioned, Kherson, which is essentially the first region north of Crimea. So when Russian forces moved north from Crimea, Kherson was the first place they ended up, and they met quite little resistance there. And then they went east through Zaporizhia to the first major city where the fighting got intense, which was Mariupol, technically part of the Donetsk region, but adjacent to Zaporizhia. And the areas in Kharkiv that they still control are in significant part lines of communication for their effort in the Donbass. So essentially the war effort really shifted east. But Russia ended up with these two southern regions as well. And we've seen a fair amount of improvisation, I think, in Russian strategy involving like what to do with those two regions, which is a bit disconcerting because given that this is the largest stakes effort of, the use of force by Russia outside of its borders, arguably since World War II, you'd think they'd want more concrete objectives. But if the objectives were really about the Donbass, as has been stated, at least until recently, then why have these two other regions as well? So the Russian effort in recent weeks has centered around taking the final population centers in the Donbass macro region, so basically which are mostly in the Donetsk province. And there are only a few left, but they are extremely well defended because they're the areas relatively close to where the front line was for 8 years. And Ukraine had the opportunity to build a lot of defensive positions there. So it's not going to be easy. In fact, there's a question as to whether Russia is in a position to really finish the job there. In the meantime, it's trying to maintain control of those two regions in the south and keep what it has in Kharkiv to supply its effort in the Donbass. And, so I think what we're going to see, and we've already started to see, is that Ukraine is attempting a counteroffensive in the south, potentially to try to retake Kherson region. So far, there have mostly just been sort of strikes behind enemy lines, small efforts at probing, but nothing big. If we are to believe the advertising, there's a major counteroffensive to come in the next couple of months. And so that's, I think, where we are. Russia's stretched pretty thin. And so, it's not impossible that the Ukrainians will have some tactical or even operational success with a counteroffensive if they try one, but it's also possible that they won't. We haven't seen much capacity to retake areas that the other side has taken by force. We've seen retreats, but we haven't seen that kind of force-on-force engagement that really pushes one side back or the other since the very early weeks.
Yeah, what do you think Russia's main goal is at this point?
Well, the challenge here is that I think it has evolved. It's, at this point, if it were, just about the Donbass region, controlling these other areas doesn't really make any sense. And they seem to be moving towards permanently taking hold of those areas. There's talk about annexation that just made the Western press in the last few days, but really it's been floating around in Russian sources for a while now, and plans for sort of political incorporation, the issuing of passports, Russian political managers showing up in these places. And so there's a question as to what really the broader objective is. Is it just about taking the Donbass? Is it about taking the Donbass plus these two other regions? Would territory in itself be enough? And there, my sense is that it wouldn't, that Russia has these broader demands about, Ukraine regarding alliance membership and possibility of foreign bases on Ukrainian soil and so on that we saw when they were actually negotiating. So I would bet that if Russia is satisfied with its territorial acquisitions at some point, it then turns back to the table and puts the same political demands that it had been putting forward back in March on the table again. Challenge is that would then be impossible for the Ukrainian government to agree to, and it might even be impossible today. But certainly, if Russia annexes parts of Ukraine's south, it would be very hard for any Ukrainian government to agree to a broader political settlement with Russia.
Yeah. Do we know how much of each side's original fighting capacity remains operational today? Is either side getting close to being worn down and struggling to carry on the war?
So confident predictions about where the sides are in terms of their capabilities have been usually off the mark in this war. Yeah. So the short answer is we don't really know. We have some signs that the Russians are reaching... Well, first of all, we know that they've depleted a lot of their, for example, precision-guided missiles, although they do have many left, of course. They are fighting with a peacetime military. So they have not conducted a formal, broader mobilization, and that is causing strain. There's sort of a soft mobilization ongoing where, people who've gone through their compulsory service are being offered quite large sums to sign contracts and become, essentially what we would think of as enlisted. soldiers. They are, offering incentives to a broader swath of society, including even inmates. So there's clearly a manpower issue on the Russian side. How critical it is another story, and we don't really know. So I think it's clear that Russia has, given that it has so far hasn't decided to move to a broader mobilization and is going to fight with its peacetime forces, there are limits, and there is at least some sense that there's a degree of exhaustion setting in and some diminishment of their actual, hardware.
Yeah.
On the Ukrainian side, they don't have a numbers problem because they have mobilized, but they do have, you can't just throw people with a week of training into a war like this. So they've got a training problem. They have an ammunition problem, an equipment problem, which is why they're often talking about getting more weapons from the West. And, there's a question mark as to whether with those problems, how capable a force are they in terms of actual maneuver warfare, combined arms warfare, given the relative weakness of capabilities like their Air Force. But, clearly they've shown that they can, they've been quite effective in terms of imposing costs on Russia as they take territory. So not making it quite difficult for Russia in the Donbass, and using these new systems that they've been given to impose costs on the occupation of the South. So, I think the big question for analysts looking at this now is whether their counteroffensive that's been advertised can succeed.
Yeah.
And I think, there are reasons to think it can and there are reasons to think they'll struggle. So it's a big open question.
Yeah. Does either country seem interested in negotiating a ceasefire agreement at this stage?
So the short answer is no. I think that there's a view on both sides that they're not done on the battlefield yet, and that they at least want to continue to try to push. In Russia's case, I think it would really want to take some of the major areas remaining in the Donbass. And we're talking about, relatively small cities by population, but they're just very well defended. So that might take a while. So I don't see Russia stopping before that.
Yeah.
If it does, and Ukraine, I think, is going to have a hard time under any circumstances coming to terms with even a de facto acceptance of the Russian control over the South.
Yeah.
There's their economic interests there at stake, and so I think there's a view on both sides that they want to keep fighting.
Yeah. Okay. Looping back to check it on things we discussed in March. Has your theory of what is motivating Putin and the Russian state evolved much since we last spoke?
I mean, I think the short version is probably not, although I'm trying to recall exactly what I said back then. I think that there's what has set in is a degree of strategic incoherence that I would not have anticipated, given the stakes, the sort of lack of a clearly articulated objective, and the way that there's no sort of coherent linkage between the use of force and achieving that political objective seems, I mean, this is sort of more on tactics rather than on objectives, broadly speaking. But that has been surprising. But I think generally speaking, I haven't changed my view on the big picture.
Yeah. I guess in the early days of the war, I felt myself more drawn towards the realist, security-focused explanations for Putin's decisions, maybe because they're just things that make more sense to me as someone who's not close to the issue at all. Having learned a little bit more about Eastern European history since then, I guess I've learned more about just the very long-term history of hundreds of years of Russia just kind of consistently being very interested in intervening in other Eastern European countries whenever it kind of got the chance. And maybe it's general sense of entitlement, perhaps, that these are countries in its sphere of influence or naturally part of its empire. Which is maybe reconsider. Maybe Putin is kind of just telling the truth when he says that he's motivated by these cultural factors, thinking that Ukraine is just a made up country, that the idea that it's a foreign state is a ridiculous notion. All of those kinds of stuff that he says in his speeches, at least the speeches back in February. Yeah, do you have any reaction to that?
Sure. So it is certainly the case that the current Russian elite's attitude towards many of its neighbors, and particularly Ukraine, is a big part of the problem, so to speak. and that they have never fully come to grips with their neighbors as fully sovereign, equal states. There's a significant imperial hangover in that respect, and you could make the case that this is something of an imperial war, I guess, or a post-imperial war. But so first of all, I think it's a bit too deterministic to say that just because there were Russian wars against its smaller neighbors in the past, therefore this is why that's happening.
Yeah.
And second, on the Putin's sort of dismissive attitude towards Ukraine, which is certainly present, I think the question is that why he went to war, right? I mean, and is Russia more generally willing to fight over that?
Yeah.
And I think that is where I might diverge from the sort of cultural or imperialistic explanation of Russian behavior. I do think that attitude is present and could be an important sort of secondary factor, but without the sort of primary ones that I think are realist is probably not the right term, but at least this sort of security-driven factors. I wouldn't see the cultural factors in themselves producing this outcome. And I think that's really important when we want to think about Russia more broadly. It might have sort of imperialistic dreams or, Putin might fantasize about X, Y, or Z. But the key question is not what he would want in his ideal world, but what he's prepared to, act upon.
Yeah.
And in the heat of war, it's obviously easy to be distracted by the rhetoric that we've heard. But that, I think, is the key thing to focus on is, what he's capable of doing and what he's willing to use his capabilities to do.
Yeah. In March, we were both inclined to say that it would have been in Ukraine's selfish interest to make more painful concessions in order to prevent itself from being invaded. Do you still feel that way?
I mean, in an alternative universe where there could have been a bad, from Ukraine's perspective, implementation of the so-called Minsk agreements, the agreements that were supposed to be implemented following the 2014-2015 sort of first Russian invasion, that would have seen the Donbass region reintegrated into Ukraine on Russian terms, essentially. I can't imagine how anyone could think of that as being worse than this war. In other words, that seems, even if it would have been bad, it would have just been politically bad. It wouldn't have entailed all this death and destruction. And that's not to say that I would guarantee that would have prevented the war. But if we're choosing in this sort of abstract, counterfactual sense between Minsk implementation and the war, I mean, it seems obvious to me which would have been better for Ukraine. If we were talking about closer to the conflict, something about dealing with this NATO question in a more definitive way, if that had avoided the war, I can't see how... the war has been pretty catastrophic for Ukraine. And we should really not lose sight of that for its people, its infrastructure, the future of its economy. Just even the loss of territory. So it's hard to imagine outcomes worse than this that were on the table before.
Yeah. Yes. So in April and May, a lot of people I was reading online were expecting Russia to escalate to kind of a full war mobilization and force more troops onto the field, rather than continuing to pretend it's just doing this special military operation and it's not at war. But it never actually has done that, and it doesn't seem like it's about to. Is there anything to learn from that experience?
So I think what we can take away from that is that there's two things, possibly. One is that Putin is not prepared to completely risk the domestic order that he has presided over, because a mobilization would really be a sort of revolution in terms of Russia's domestic situation. The messaging in major cities to the Russian public is that nothing's changed. And, therefore, life goes on as it used to. And that, I think, has been part of the strategy, essentially, to avoid any sort of domestic unrest. And so I think that's part of it. And that is a constraint. If I don't think Putin would, if things got really bad, he might change his mind. But barring a dramatic shift on the battlefield, I think we see this, that basically it's a self-restraint on how far he's willing to go in terms of using force and the numbers he's prepared to put to it in Ukraine. The second part of it is that this is there's something of a leaving open a window to some return to something less than a total state of war after this is over, and having some sort of economy to turn back to. So I think in a way it points to some ways in which this has not yet become a sort of total war for Russian society by deliberate policy steps of the government.
Yeah. Because speaking of the economy, back in March, we thought that the sanctions, Western sanctions, had really been turned up to 11 almost immediately. And maybe we thought this would have a massive impact on the Russian economy and maybe normal life for Russians. How has that actually played out?
So basically, it is accurate to say we went to 11. It's just that in the meantime, we've been filling in 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, I think, in terms of steps on sanctions. Like if you look at, compare the seventh EU sanctions package that is now on the table, it's way less significant than the first. And so I guess by talking about things going to 11 immediately, we skipped a lot of intermediate steps.
I see.
And in a way, the gradation of this, it just got a little bit
out of order.
Yes, indeed. So one thing that is certainly the case is that the energy revenues, and Russia's taking in something like $1 billion a day in energy revenue, have compensated for both the freezing of the central bank assets and some of the broader economic dislocation that the sanctions have caused. There's no question that even in the short term, these measures, and combined with the sort of self-sanctioning of Western corporates that have exited Russia en masse, will have both a short and especially a medium to long-term effect on the Russian economy. So the Russian economy will slow between 5 and 10% this year by all measures. But over the longer term, Russia's ability to grow will be significantly limited. And so sanctions, I guess maybe they were so unprecedented and by that measure extreme that we were sort of in uncharted waters then. What has been striking is the overall resilience of the Russian economy and the extent to which basically any short-term shock has been managed by Russia's very competent macroeconomic policymakers. But over the medium to long term, they're going to have, there's no way that they can continue to put Band-Aids on this. So there's going to be an impact for sure. And we're seeing it, it's going to start with specific sectors and areas where certain technologies are now can't be imported, where, on certain oil extraction projects, like in Sakhalin, they were reliant on their Western partners who've now exited. They can't now get the oil out of the water. So it's this is going to be felt across the economy, and Russia will end up as a much more primitive economy. I guess, though, we should think about countries like Iran, where, collapse, although predicted many times, has never occurred. So this will be painful for sure.
There's a lot of ruin in a nation, or it can take a long time for a country to fall apart.
Yes, exactly.
I guess, in the first few weeks of the war, I think everyone was taken aback by how kind of blundering Russia's military strategy seemed to be. Is it fair to say that Russia has learned quite a lot from its early mistakes and adopted kind of more realistic goals and a military strategy that might actually be able to accomplish them?
So the military was so wrong-footed by the terrible plan that they were told to execute, essentially, where they were prepared for a 3-day war, and it didn't turn out that way. Yeah. Where there would be no resistance, minimal resistance from the adversary military, and this would just be about sort of taking the capital and installing a different government. And that obviously was a total catastrophe. And of course, what they have done, arguably since maybe May, is fight like they train. And that has had a pretty devastating effect because, the saying about the Russian military is that it's an artillery military with lots of tanks. And they have used that artillery to sort of devastating effect in the Donbass. And yes, so I think basically they have put themselves in a position to take advantage of their
strengths.
Yeah, exactly. Now, they were so wrong-footed by that initial mess that they put themselves in that they really, lost a lot of equipment. And the morale factor, I think, has been pretty big in all of this because, we've learned that soldiers didn't even know that they were going to Ukraine until they were in Ukraine. And the narrative around why they were doing this was not really coherent. So that has had an impact, a lasting impact. But yes, I think that they've adopted a more sensible approach. There seemed to be more senior leadership and coordination. That it is no guarantee of success. And we're also learning, I think, some things, and this is still to be examined more deeply once we have a better sense of what's actually going on, about the limits maybe of land warfare. And maybe it's harder than we thought.
Yeah, it makes sense. Back in March, you thought that Finland and Sweden joining NATO while the war was still ongoing would be risky and potentially quite provocative. And I think you said it would likely be a mistake. Yeah, how do you feel about that with the benefit of hindsight?
It's happening. And what has been interesting is that basically it very quickly went from, and I talked to Finnish people, and it went from a sort of shift in public opinion to a shift in policy in like weeks, after decades of having a different policy. So Finland, really, the shift was quite rapid and profound. And the president, who previously had been the sort of guardian of this policy of non-alignment, really embraced and rode the wave of public opinion, I guess.
Yeah.
What has been interesting is that Russia has been quite specific about what would be a problem in this context for Russia. In other words, they focus less on membership per se and more on deployments and infrastructure in Finland and Sweden. And, frankly, this will pose challenges for NATO. It's going to be a whole lot more of a border to defend. And the question about how to defend it is going to be a big one. And whether Finland is going to be prepared to, say, undertake the kind of self-restraint commitments that Norway has as a NATO member, where Norway voluntarily doesn't accept foreign forces permanently stationed on its territory and no nuclear weapons also, and has agreed to, essentially de facto limits the forces that it positions along the border with Russia in the far north. So they're going to have to be a whole new set of procedures. I guess it's too early to say whether there will be significant risks from this in the future. What I would say is that, it's happening, and we need to, adjust accordingly. And, I think one thing that is true is that Russia has been more singularly focused on Ukraine than I would have expected in this context. In other words, they have not sought to sort of, even using non-kinetic means, horizontally escalate, and I think don't want to open a second front right now. So in a way, the war played differently than I would have expected, or I anticipated, or I feared, in that by raising general tensions and then you take a step that is sort of potentially threatening in an environment of increased tensions, that causes things to happen that potentially wouldn't have happened otherwise. That was the scenario that I was concerned about. In the event, Russia's so bogged down that I think it's not willing to open up.
Not keen to take on more projects.
Yeah.
Back in March, on March 10th, with Russia doing really quite poorly militarily, I was worried about all kinds of different ways that things might possibly get a whole lot worse, including Russia using tactical nuclear weapons, possibly attacking another state like Moldova or Lithuania. I guess, Russia accusing Ukraine of using biological weapons as a pretense to use them itself, which it's kind of maybe seemed to be preparing to do. And I guess also the possibility of really damaging cyber attacks going in both directions. Now, I didn't exactly think any of those things was especially more likely to happen than not, but it seems like kind of none of them happened. And indeed, I'm not really sure that any of them was, in fact, super close to happening. Is there anything we can learn from that experience?
Yeah. So I think this entire process, and particularly with the weapons shipments, has been a learning process about the nature of what potentially drives escalation. And I think, in a sense, we've learned that nuclear deterrence works, right? That Russia is deterred from attacking NATO countries, even when they do things that end up killing a lot of Russian soldiers. we've learned also that it works the other way around, and that NATO countries are restrained in what they're prepared to do to, in terms of getting involved. Although we are far more involved than anyone would have imagined back in March in terms of the quantity and quality of weapons being delivered. I think the narrow takeaway in terms of what might prompt escalation that I would tentatively make from all of this is that essentially, so long as Russia is winning, from Russia's perspective, their incentives to really dramatically escalate aren't there. So I think that they would have to be in a position where, given the consequences of horizontal escalation, particularly involving NATO, where, of desperation, really, to do that. And they're not. And I think that gets at the way in which, ultimately we're talking about when we say words like deterrence or escalation. We're talking about psychology here, and the psychology of the decision makers and where their mindset is, essentially. And I think what we've learned is that there's an extent to which, so long as things are broadly going well from Russia's perspective, they're not going to dramatically rock the boat.
Throw
At least
over the
that's
table.
where things are right now.
Yeah. I guess one thing I maybe take away from this is that it's in Russia's interest maybe to, and indeed like often adversaries' interest, to kind of psych you out and like make you think that they might be capable of doing all kinds of other stuff in order to just make you worry and make you cautious. And it's really hard to tell. It's almost impossible to tell if they're doing a good job, whether they are sincere with those threats or whether it is a kind of an act, just a menacing act. I guess possibly in future I might take things like Russia claiming to have found imaginary bioweapons facilities in Ukraine as a bit more of a matter of theater than a presage to actually using biological weapons themselves, for example.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that there's a bit of that, but keep in mind that back in March, it was not entirely clear at all that NATO wasn't going to intervene directly. I mean, it was a relatively new conflict, and so you could interpret a lot of the Russian posturing as trying to signal about that.
I see.
And, in a way, that kind of deterrence has worked. If you recall, I mean, it seems like a million years ago, but there was a quite, at least serious public discussion about a no-fly zone, which is totally dissipated, although sort of similar ideas came back with this idea of using force to take the grain out of Ukrainian ports. In other words, like trying to find a way of not using the direct let's go to war with Russia sentence.
While still doing so.
Hiding that under things like no-fly zone or, freeing ports. The thing I would say, though, is that just because this hasn't happened yet doesn't mean we shouldn't be worried about it. And I think, escalation concerns rightly remain, top of mind for certainly here in Washington and I imagine in other NATO capitals, because as much as there is a drive to assist the Ukrainians and to push back on this Russian aggression, there's also a view that we just don't want to have a conflict between Russia and NATO come out of this.
Yeah, totally.
And I think that does factor into decision making, and that's,
to the good.
Yeah, I would say.
Yeah. Is there a standout policy change or a change in activities that you might like to see from the US or NATO countries?
Well, so big picture, and we haven't sort of talked about this, I can't see how we're heading towards a sort of good outcome right now. As time goes on, and if the war continues at this relative pace, not only do we see Russian moves to making some of its territorial, the areas that it is currently under its control, more permanent, but, there's a lot of death and destruction being run on Ukraine every day.
Yeah.
And, I think there's a bit of, and this, is in part driven by the Ukrainians' openly stated desire to continue the fight and requests for more means to do so. So this is not coming from nowhere, but there's a bit of complacency about the war, not in the sense that people don't think it's a problem, but that there's no urge to bring it to an end soon. And in my view, the longer this goes on, the worse it is for Ukraine and for the interests of the United States and its allies. So, I think that we're not necessarily because we should be stopping doing anything we're doing on sanctions or military assistance, but I'd like to see a track, even if maybe I don't see it, but I have a feeling that it doesn't exist, of channels of communication kept open on the terms of a potential ceasefire.
Yeah.
Not because we need to have one right now, but because I think we need to be trying to find and identify the space for a potential compromise. And there's just nothing by way of negotiation going on right now.
Right.
And that does concern me. Of course, if that's a two-way street, and if the Russians aren't willing to engage...
there's only so much one can do.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll come back to a possible path we might imagine towards a ceasefire in a minute. But as recently as January 2021, the New START treaty between the US and Russia was extended for 5 years. And this is a super important treaty that caps how many nuclear weapons each country can have deployed at any given point in time. It can't be extended again in 2026, so a new treaty is going to have to be negotiated, or ideally a new treaty would be negotiated to replace it before then. Is there anything we can do to make that more likely?
Well, actually, that relates to the previous question, believe it or not,
right.
Because there's no way that negotiations can begin so long as fighting is continuing at this level.
Yeah.
So I think the first step towards getting a follow-on to New START is to
bring this war to a close,
to end the fighting, to create the political space to begin talks on this, because the Biden administration came in and took an expansive view on dialogue with Russia on strategic stability, and wanted to include, basically to have a strategic stability dialogue that would be broad and, extend over the course of potentially a couple of years to get to the point where we would know exactly what we wanted and maybe have multiple agreements and so on. That is just not in the cards now. And the time scale is clearly much more limited to negotiate something new before New START expires. So, there's going to have to be a pivot, if and when there is a ceasefire or some sort of settlement, to opening up that channel and beginning those talks, because it's unlikely that the parties are going to be interested in just copy pasting the existing treaty.
Yeah.
And it's going to be hard, frankly, to get a treaty ratified in the U.S. context. So this isn't going to be easy, and beginning talks sooner rather than later would be, I think, the first step to getting us there.
So we'd like to see the fighting end for all kinds of reasons, and this just adds more urgency to it, that because we're running out of time to start these negotiations. Yeah, to that end, in June you wrote an article for Foreign Affairs titled "Ukraine's Best Chance for Peace." In there, you promote a proposal from the peace negotiations that Russia and Ukraine were engaging in back in March in Istanbul. And it's an idea that both sides seemed at least lukewarm to, or possibly open to at the time, which you think might be our best shot at ending the war and preventing it from just starting again at some point in the future. The key pieces in the proposal are that, on the one hand, Ukraine agrees not to join NATO and not to allow foreign militaries to operate on its territory. And in return for remaining neutral in this way, Ukraine gets agreements from the US and Europe that they will help it if militarily attacked. And Russia accepts that promise, basically. And Russia would also, in principle, drop its opposition to Ukraine joining the EU. On the potentially really hard sticking point of accepting territorial annexation, the proposal doesn't require Ukraine to accept Russia taking its territory, but it also wouldn't apply to the areas that Russia already controls, so it wouldn't require them to leave necessarily either. Why do you think this is a promising starting point for a possible agreement?
Well, first of all, because the parties themselves came up with it and said made positive noises about it themselves. So it wasn't a sort of peace plan that sitting here in DC I came up with. So that's the first advantage. I think the second is that it offers a potential vision for what a settlement could look like that Russia is bought into. So one of the key challenges with any settlement is to ensure that this doesn't happen again, right? And that Ukraine is able to recover without threats to its security that undermine any economic recovery. And yeah, if Russia is determined, no matter what kind of territory is taken, to threaten the rest of Ukraine, its long-term economic viability is going to be a serious challenge. So getting Russian buy-in to the settlement, as counterintuitive as that might seem, because of course Russia has committed war crimes, it is the aggressor here, is potentially the way you get to a settlement that really produces stability over the long term. And it seemed to be an innovative approach whereby every party kind of can claim victory in one way or another. Ukraine gets these security guarantees. Russia gets, this commitment, including international legal commitment to Ukraine being a permanently neutral country. The West gets a green light for Ukraine's eventual EU membership, and thus, I think, really a fulsome exit of Ukraine from Russia's so-called sphere of influence. So, you could see how everyone might come out of this thinking that they had gained something. Of course, this was before the war crimes, around Kiev and towns like Bucha became public. This was before the rocket attacks on other Ukrainian cities that have occurred in the last few weeks and the really brutal fighting in the Donbass. And the parties have, walked away from it to a certain extent. But I think it was important to just bring it forward because it was this moment when they were actually talking and they did produce something that might be at least incorporated into something that could be used in the future.
Yeah, have there been any sides of interest in this idea since you wrote the article, or are they're not talking to one another, so it's hard to say?
Well, I think the negotiations, they aren't talking, but that's what's on the table. So if they ever do return to it, it in theory would be where they would pick up from. There have been recent noises about whether from both the Russian and the Ukrainian side that they, would be taking a much more hardline position. And the key issue, which the Istanbul communique, the proposal that I analyzed, didn't address, was the question of territorial control. And it's hard for me to see, and I was alluding to this earlier, how this kind of a settlement could be implemented if Russia annexes big parts of Ukraine. It's just not, the Ukrainian government's not going to be in a position to say, okay, well, sign up to this deal after you've taken, another chunk of the country.
Yeah.
So, I think that makes me pessimistic about prospects of any settlement.
Yeah.
There are other ways wars end, but the settlement path is seeming less and less likely.
Yeah. Can you explain how a similar proposal to this one was useful in the case of Belgium in the 19th century? I didn't know this history, and I think it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, so Belgium was granted independence in a series of treaties signed between 1831 and 1837 by the Concert of Europe, so the major European powers, and the Dutch, who were then occupying or essentially ruling Belgium, and the Belgians revolted against them. But basically, the treaty that granted Belgium its independence also enshrined it as a permanently neutral state, and the parties to it fixed their guarantee. So basically, Belgium's independence, its permanent neutrality, and its security were sort of tied together in this treaty, the Treaty of London, at least one of them, the key one, was known. And this is most remembered today for its failure when of course, Germany invaded Belgium as the first major military operation of World War I, and that was what, of course, brought the UK into the war because of its guarantee to Belgium. But, 75 years of peace that it did have was 3 times as long as Ukraine had as an independent state. The model that it provides of sort of geopolitical rivals guaranteeing the security of a neutral state in which they all have stakes and, their security is all affected by it in different ways was, I think, the key analogy. And, Belgium seems kind of like a geopolitical backwater today, but for France and Germany at the time, it was this sort of key area through which they invaded each other.
Yeah.
Because of the topography of that part of Europe, it was the low areas that provided the clearest invasion route. It was also quite fertile area, something of an agricultural powerhouse. It was important for its ports for the UK as and maritime security, given its closeness to the Channel. So, all the powers had some stake in seeing it belong to none of them, so to speak. Yeah. And that I think was the analogy and an interesting historical parallel.
Yeah. I guess the main thing that worries me about this proposal is, I suppose, ultimately that did break down and was involved in or implicated in the start of World War I. In principle, this would mean Russia signing up to the US, providing like security guarantees to Ukraine and saying it would intervene if Ukraine is invaded or it would help Ukraine. Of course, if Russia at some point in the future has a crazy leader or just thinks that commitment is incredible and does attack Ukraine, then it more strongly implies that the US needs to directly intervene and it could lead to a shooting war between the US and Russia. Yeah, do you think that's kind of maybe the main drawback here?
That is certainly one of the the key sort of strategic risk involved. To take a step back, of course, Germany did invade Belgium in order to invade France, right? It wasn't. This wasn't just a sort of isolated thing that if Britain hadn't responded by invoking its guarantee, that
everything would have been
the whole thing would have gone away. Yeah, by that point, the war was kind of an inevitability. But the key question that you're getting at is whether Western countries, the U.S. and its NATO allies, are going to have to take risks if they want a settlement that produces long-term stability, that ensures that this doesn't happen again. And it might be the case that we do have to take risks. And frankly, the consequences of this war have been so severe that there's a case for taking risks to make sure it doesn't happen again.
Yeah.
So, I think the question about that you raise about, if Russia were to do this again, if that agreement were implemented, Russia were to do this again, it would imply that the U.S. would actually come to Ukraine's assistance with its own military. Yes, but it also presumably would affect Russian decision-making accordingly, right? That Russia would be loath to risk that. Yes, of course, if someone crazy comes to power in any country, all things go out the window. But this, I think, gets to some of the things that we should be thinking about what we're prepared to put on the table to ensure that this ends in a way that creates longer-term stability. Commitments of some kind are likely to be part of the picture. The question is what kind and what risks they create.
Yeah. What's the reaction been to your article kind of among your colleagues in the foreign policy establishment in the US?
Mixed, of course. I think, the models for how this might end and some thought about settlements and ways out are welcome at this point. I wasn't proposing this as something that could be taken off the shelf and used right now. And I do see a lot of problems with the proposal. I think it shouldn't be forgotten is that it's the only path I've seen that sort of gets us to, a comprehensive settlement. The other ways out of this are going to be much more potentially short-term and short-lived, thinking potentially, or they just won't resolve the underlying political issues and will leave us with significant tensions that could explode again in a couple years. So, if it's not going to be a settlement, it will be, and the war actually does end, it will be something like an armistice or a ceasefire that is potentially of, limited duration and doesn't resolve any of the underlying security issues and thus leads to, continuous Russian threats to Ukraine, a continuous crisis of European security, continual economic dislocation from all of this. So even though there are a lot of reasons to be skeptical that we'll ever get there, we should be at least thinking about what the best case could be based on where the parties were, at least at one point. So I think that idea has gotten some good reception. Of course, others have different views. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I think I saw on Twitter that I suppose whenever people start talking about making a deal with Putin, many people just find that abhorrent because they hate what he's done so much that the idea of coming to the negotiating table and conceding anything is just very difficult emotionally.
Totally. And that's completely understandable, particularly for Ukrainians. I mean, I think what was striking, not that I tend to pay attention too much to what's said on Twitter, but it was almost as if of course, usually the people don't read this, but whatever they are criticizing on Twitter. But this wasn't my idea. I was just analyzing something that actually the Ukrainians came up with.
Right.
They might have walked away from it, but it's not like I'm thinking up something and imposing it on them. This was their proposal. So people have problems with it, so do I, right? But yes, I think more broadly, what you're getting at is a key political dynamic that is very acute in Ukraine and limits the extent to which the Ukrainian government is going to be able to negotiate with the Russians, because there's a lot of anger, as you might understand, given all what Russia has wrought. And that anger exists and emotion exists in Western publics as well. So it will be hard to imagine any Western leader ever sitting down with Putin again. And, that complicates diplomacy, to put it mildly. That's just a fact. So, I don't know how to fix this problem, but the idea that Russia will be forced into accepting an outcome, through coercive means exclusively. That doesn't mean some element of coercion won't be part of the picture, but that it will be compelled to accept an outcome without getting anything seems low probability. So we got to think about ones that are more within the realm of the probable, even if they are unsatisfactory and unsavory.
Totally. Yeah, I know you got to run in a minute, but I guess the final question is just, I mean, no one would wish for this, but I guess to some extent, as an expert on Russia and Ukraine, this is kind of your moment as possibly, a year when you might be able to have more impact or do more to help people than you might at any other time in your career. Yeah, how are you hoping that your work might be able to contribute to among the least bad outcomes that's imaginable here?
Well, I guess to a certain extent, some of my work, which can be quite in the weeds on researching, and now also researching this war and doing it in the kind of detail that probably would be boring for our listeners. Let's put it that way. It might not have the kind of direct impact that you're referring to, but what I've seen is my role, at least, and doing this a lot on sort of my own time, is trying to think about the ways that this can end without consequences, with minimal consequences for particularly Ukraine, but also the rest of the world, and trying to put out ideas. I mean, if think tanks are there for anything, they're at least, they should be there to put new ideas into the sort of public discussion and to foster debate. And so at this point, I sort of see to a certain extent as my duty to keep that up. And I hope to be able to continue to do it, at least, although I wouldn't, want this kind of, obviously it's this sort of the spotlight is not something I would wish because of the consequences of it. But I do feel something of an obligation to try to push for better outcomes, given that I have more of a microphone than I would have otherwise.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really hard to see what the path out of this is, but we still have to dare to dream. So keep up the good work. Hopefully at some point a path out will become visible. My guest today has been Sam Charap. Thanks so much for coming back on the podcast, Sam.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, I'll now go into a bit more detail about our user survey and that new marketing role, which I teased you with in the intro. As I mentioned, we are currently running our user survey, which is one of the main ways we figure out what among all of the things that 80,000 Hours does are most helpful, which are potentially not that useful to you, and which might even be harmful. You can find it at 80,000hours.org/survey. Of course, the team here has to be constantly thinking about what to write next, what roles to hire for, which podcast episodes to produce next, and so on. And your input can potentially be super helpful with all of that. We have plenty of things going on here at 80,000 Hours, including this show, our other show, 80K After Hours, our job board, our various different kinds of research articles, our one-on-one advising, and our marketing outreach efforts to reach new folks, among other projects. So naturally, prioritization can be a bit of a challenge, and there's a lot of topics you might be able to give us advice on. Normally, we do the user survey once a year, but we skipped it in 2021 so that we could just stay focused on delivering our projects, which I think was the right call, but it means that we're particularly keen to know how things have shifted over the last 2 years. If you filled out the user survey before, it's pretty likely that your plans and opinions are going to have changed over the last 2 years. So if you're open to filling it out again, we would really appreciate that. We're equally keen to hear how you feel about 80,000 Hours, if the impact that we've had on you think is positive or neutral or negative, and if you've changed your plans for how you expect to do good, as well as if interacting with 80,000 Hours has made no difference to your plans at all. On average, people take about 25 minutes to fill out the user survey. If you were moving fast or had fairly simple things to say, you could probably get through it in 10 or 15 minutes. On the other hand, if you're someone with a complex story and subtle things you want to communicate to us, that would take a bit longer. However much you write, I can promise you that every entry gets read all the way through by multiple people on our end. Again, you can find it at 80,000hours.org/survey. Second, we're hiring someone to join our marketing team to help more people find out about this show, as well as all the other services that 80,000 Hours has to offer. From the start of this year, we've begun investing much more heavily in getting the word out about how we can help folks have more impact, as reaching more people is a pretty obvious and natural way that we can hopefully do more good as an organization. Since then, we've found a few things that we think are working, and so we want to try to do more of them. But to make that happen, we need more people on the marketing team than just Bella Forrestal. Someone who would be right for this role would be pretty excited about effective altruism or 80,000 Hours mission. They might have a background in marketing, especially digital or influencer marketing, but our experience is that that's not necessarily essential, and we want to hear from people without jobs like that on their CV as well. Keep in mind, this isn't exactly a traditional marketing position, since we are, after all, a nonprofit, and in fact, we're not selling anything for money at all. So we'd love you to apply, even if you aren't otherwise thinking of yourself as a professional marketer per se. The role is a full-time one. Ideally, it would be done in person at our office in London, and it would pay around £60,000, assuming you had little or no prior experience, but more than that if you did. If that piques your interest at all, you can find out plenty more about that role at 80,000hours.org/marketer, and keep in mind applications for that one will close on the 23rd of August. All right, the 80,000 Hours podcast is produced and edited by Kieran Harris, audio mastering and technical editing for this episode by Ben Cordell and Ryan Kessler. Full transcripts and an extensive collection of links to learn more are available on our site and put together this week, as every week, by Katie Moore. Thanks for joining. Talk to you again soon.